In drought-stricken Ashwick, a gambler auctions his daughters to settle debts. A quiet rancher intervenes, offering refuge. Will trust bloom or break under the shadow of their past? Welcome to Life Bond Tales. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories. The town of Ashwick baked under a relentless sun, its streets choked with dust that clung to boots and wagon wheels like a second skin. For a month, no rain had fallen, and the sky hung heavy, a pale canvas stretched taut as if the heavens themselves were too weary to weep. Outside the Rusty Spur saloon, a platform of splintered crates and warped planks stood as a stage for desperation, its nails hammered in haste to bear the weight of a grim spectacle. A crowd gathered before noon, a mix of restless farmers, sharp-eyed, drifters and townsfolk, with nothing better to do than watch a man sell his shame. Jasper Vance stood atop the platform, his coat frayed, his smile sharp as a blade, dealing a worn deck of cards with the ease of a gambler who'd long since stopped, caring about the game. His voice cut through the dry air, brash and unyielding, as he called out to the crowd, offering his daughters, Clara, Rose and Lila, for a price to settle debts he'd piled high as the hills. Clara, the eldest at 20, stood with her arms crossed, her dark eyes sweeping the crowd, daring anyone to meet her gaze. Her jaw set like iron forged in grief. Rose, 18 and fierce, clenched her fists, her lips curling at the jeers from men with liquor on their breath, her body taut as if ready to bolt or fight. Lila, just 15, stood a step behind, her small frame swaying, humming a tune no one else could hear, her eyes fixed on a horizon only she could see. The crowd murmured, some with pity, others with greed, as Jasper's voice grew louder, his words crude, promising girls who could cook, clean, or warm a bed, depending on the bidder's coin. Across the square, Elias Hawthorne leaned against his wagon, his broad shoulders slouched, his beard streaked with early grey, his sons, Samuel, Nathan and Jacob, sitting behind him, their faces tight with unease. Elias had come for flour, wire and a sack of beans. Not for this, but the sight of the sisters stirred something deep, a memory of his late wife's quiet strength, her hands worn from tending a garden that never bloomed. Clara's defiance reminded him of her. Rose's fire echoed her stubborn heart, and Lila's fragility mirrored the sister she'd lost too young. Jasper's voice rang out again, setting a price, $10 each, 30 for the lot, and the crowd's silence was a wound, broken only by a coarse laugh from a man in a stained hat. Elias's hands tightened on the wagon's edge, his sons glancing at him, sensing the shift in his stance. He stepped forward, boots stirring dust, his voice low but clear as a bell in the stillness. "Untie them. Let them go." Jasper blinked, his smirk faltering, but he laughed, asking who Elias thought he was to interrupt a fair deal. Elias didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "A man who knows right from wrong. Get off that platform before I drag you down." The crowd parted. As he approached, eyes dropping to the dirt, ashamed or afraid. Jasper's hand twitched toward his belt, but Elias's gaze was a wall, unyielding, and the gambler stepped back, muttering curses. Clara looked at Elias, her eyes narrowing, searching for the catch, but he met her stare with a nod. "You're free. If you've got nowhere to go, my ranch has room, no debts, no demands." Rose's fists loosened, Lila's humming paused, and for a moment the world held its breath. The sisters stepped down, moving as one, and climbed into the wagon, settling among sacks and ropes, their silence heavier than words. Elias turned, ignoring the crowd's whispers, and drove toward Willow Creek Ranch, the dust settling behind, them like a promise of something new. The wagon rolled into Willow Creek Ranch as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across fields of brittle grass and a porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. The house stood sturdy, its whitewash faded but clean, surrounded by a fence that held firm against the wind. Elias Hawthorne guided the horses to a stop, his hands steady on the reins, while his sons, Samuel, Nathan and Jacob, shifted in their seats, stealing glances at the three sisters in the back. Clara sat rigid, her hands clasped tight, eyes scanning the ranch like a map of potential traps. Rose leaned forward, her braids swinging, her gaze sharp and restless, as if measuring the distance she could run. Lila clutched a frayed shawl, her humming softer now, almost lost in the creak of the wagon wheels. Elias climbed down, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and turned to the sisters with a nod. "This is it. Not much, but it's warm and it's yours if you want it." He pointed to the house, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Clara's lips pressed thin, her voice low. "What's the price for this kindness?" Elias shook his head, his grey eyes steady. "No price, just a roof and a stove. You decide. What comes next?" The sisters exchanged looks, a silent conversation born of years surviving together, and stepped down, their movements cautious, like deer stepping into open ground. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old bread, its floors worn smooth by years of boots. Elias showed them 3 small rooms, each with a bed, a quilt, and a window that didn't leak. "One for each of you," he said. "No one enters without knocking." Rose snorted, testing him. "And if we don't want to stay?" Elias shrugged. "Gates open, but the road's long and it's getting dark." He left them there, crossing the yard to the barn, where he unrolled a blanket and settled for the night, giving them space to breathe. The sisters stood in the hallway, Clara touching the doorframe, Rose pacing like a caged hawk, Lila tracing the quilt stitches with a finger. Samuel, the eldest son, lingered near the kitchen, his broad hands fidgeting with a coil of rope, wanting to speak but swallowing the words. Nathan, wiry and quick, tried a smile, offering Lila a carved wooden spoon from his pocket. "Made it. Last winter," he said, his voice too bright. Lila took it, her fingers brushing his, and nodded, her eyes distant but curious. Jacob, the youngest, hovered by the stairs, his face half hidden under a worn hat, watching Clara like she might vanish. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that follows a storm, heavy with what's unsaid. Clara moved to the kitchen, finding a kettle and a sack of coffee, her hands moving on instinct, needing something to hold. Rose followed, wrapping herself in a quilt from the couch, her bare feet silent on the wood. "This place feels like a trap," she muttered. Clara shook her head. "Not yet. But we watch." Lila sat at the table, the spoon in her hands, turning it over like a talisman. Outside, the yellow dog barked once, then wagged its tail, circling Elias's sons as they unloaded the wagon. Samuel carried a sack of flour inside, pausing at the threshold. "Need anything?" he asked Clara, his voice soft but steady. She looked at him, searching for deceit, and found none. "Not yet," she said, and he nodded, stepping back. The first night passed slow, the house creaking under the weight of new presents. Clara lay awake, her knife under the pillow, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Rose slept in fits, her dreams sharp with memories of Jasper's voice. Lila curled tight, the spoon clutched to her chest, her humming a faint thread through the dark. Morning came soft, the light filtering through curtains thin as hope. Elias was up before dawn, grinding coffee beans with care, his movements deliberate to keep the house still. Clara appeared first, her hair tied back, her eyes heavy but sharp. She nodded at the steaming kettle, and Elias poured 2 mugs, sliding, one across the table. They drank in silence, a fragile truce. Rose came next, her quilt draped like armor, her gaze flicking to Elias, then away. "This your routine?" she asked, voice edged. "Every day," he said, not rising to the bait. Lila shuffled in last, her shawl trailing, and sat beside Rose, leaning into her sister's shoulder. Elias cleared his throat. "There's work if you want it. No one's asking you to stay busy, but the garden's dry and the fence needs mending." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You said no debts." "And I meant it. Work's just something to do if standing still feels worse." The sisters didn't answer, but Clara's fingers tightened on her mug, Rose's shoulders eased, and Lila's humming grew a fraction louder. The boys moved through the morning with care, Samuel splitting wood, Nathan tending the horses, Jacob wrestling with a crooked gate. Clara watched them from the porch, her arms crossed, noting how they kept their distance, their voices low. Nathan caught Lila staring at the garden, its soil cracked and barren. "Used to grow roses," he said almost to himself. "Ma loved them." Lila tilted her head. "What kind?" Nathan scratched his neck. "Don't know. Red ones." She nodded, filing it away. Rose wandered to the barn, her steps bold but her eyes wary, pausing when Samuel offered her a hammer to fix a loose board. "I don't need your help," she said, but took the hammer, her swings sharp and sure. Jacob stayed near the house, his hands busy with a coil of wire, his glances at Clara quick and shy. By noon the sisters had claimed their spaces, Clara in the kitchen, Rose by the barn, Lila near the garden, each move a small defiance, a refusal to be guests in a stranger's home. Elias watched from the porch, his pipe unlit, his thoughts heavy with the weight of their arrival. He'd opened his door without a plan, driven by a memory of loss and a stubborn belief that some wrongs could be righted. The sisters didn't trust him yet, and he didn't expect them to. Trust was a seed, not a harvest, and this land was too dry for quick growth. As the sun sank, painting the sky gold and bruise purple, Clara stepped outside, her mug empty. "You sleep in the barn for us?" she asked, her voice low. Elias nodded. "Seemed right." She looked at him, her guard still up but cracked just enough for light to slip through. The ranch settled into dusk, the air thick with the scent of dust and possibility, the house a quiet witness to the first steps of something unbroken. Days bled into weeks at Willow Creek Ranch, and the air began to soften, carrying the faint promise of spring despite the stubborn Neary. Clara, Rose and Lila moved through the house like ghosts learning to be human again, each finding a rhythm in the quiet spaces Elias Hawthorne had offered without demand. Clara took to the kitchen, her hands steady as she kneaded dough, not for obligation, but to anchor herself to something solid. Her biscuits were dense at first, but she worked at them daily, her focus sharp, as if perfecting the recipe could mend the cracks in her past. Rose roamed the yard, her boots kicking up, dust helping Samuel mend fences with a scowl that hid her growing ease. She hammered nails with a force that spoke of anger, but her glances at Samuel grew longer, less guarded when he matched her pace without complaint. Lila haunted the garden, her fingers tracing the dry soil, planting seeds she found in a rusted tin, whispering to them like old friends. Elias watched from a distance, his pipe in hand, knowing the sisters needed room to grow into themselves. His sons moved carefully, their rough edges smoothed by the presence of the women. Samuel, broad and steady, worked beside Clara in silence, passing her tools without being asked, his presence a quiet promise of patience. Nathan, quick and restless, found reasons to linger near Rose, offering her a canteen of water or a spare hammer, his chatter light but earnest. Jacob, shy and watchful, followed Lila to the garden, showing her how to tie stakes for the fragile sprouts she tended, his hands nervous but kind. One morning, a windstorm tore through the ranch, rattling shutters and snapping a fence line. Elias called everyone to the yard, and the sisters joined without hesitation, their hands as steady as the brothers. Clara tied ropes with precision. Rose hauled posts with a grunt, and Lila carried buckets of nails, her humming mingling with the wind. The work was hard, the sun relentless, but when the fence stood firm again, Clara wiped her brow and looked at Elias. "Why do you let us stay?" she asked, her voice low, almost lost in the breeze. Elias leaned on a post, his grey eyes steady. "Because someone should have helped you sooner, and I've got the room." Clara nodded, her lips tight but her eyes softened, a crack in her armor. Rose, catching her breath nearby, muttered, "This place is too quiet." But she stayed. Close to Samuel, her shoulder brushing his as they walked back to the house. Lila, trailing behind, paused to pick a weed, tucking it into her hair like a flower, and Jacob smiled, his face pink under his hat. Evenings brought new rituals. Clara began sitting on the porch after supper, her hands still, her eyes on the horizon. Elias joined her once, offering a mug of coffee without a word. She took it, their silence companionable, a language of trust being born. Rose challenged Nathan to stack firewood faster, her laughter sharp when she won, her competitive edge a spark that lit up his grin. Lila wove bits of twine into bracelets, leaving one on Jacob's workbench, a shy offering he tied to his wrist without comment. The brothers adapted too. Samuel spoke less of his mother's death, but more of the ranch's history. His voice, low as he told Clara about the oak tree his father planted at his birth. Nathan's stories grew less frantic, his jokes landing softer when Rose rolled her eyes but stayed to listen. Jacob, usually silent, began humming Lila's tunes under his breath, catching her eye with a nod. One afternoon, Clara found an old cookbook in the pantry, its pages yellowed but intact. She spent hours deciphering a recipe for apple pie, her hands dusted with flour, her focus unbroken even when Samuel lingered nearby sharpening a knife. "You don't have to watch me," she said, not looking up. "I'm not watching," he replied, his voice warm. "I'm learning." She snorted, but a smile flickered, brief and unguarded. Rose, meanwhile, took to the horses, brushing them with a gentleness that surprised Nathan. "Didn't think you liked animals," he said, leaning on the corral fence. "They don't lie," she replied, her hand steady on the mare's flank. Lila's garden began to show green, tiny shoots pushing through the dirt. She showed Jacob how to water them, her voice soft but sure. "They need to feel safe," she said, and he nodded, pouring slowly, as if the act were a vow. Elias carved small wooden figures in the evenings, a hawk, a fox, a sparrow, leaving them on the porch rail for the sisters to find. Clara picked up the hawk, turning it over in her hands. "You make these?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Keeps my hands busy." She tucked it into her pocket, a silent acceptance. The house began to hum with life, not loud but steady, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. The sisters ate with the brothers, their plates no longer pushed to the edge of the table. Clara's biscuits improved, earning a nod from Elias. Rose laughed once, loud and sudden, when Nathan tripped over a bucket and the sound echoed like a bell. Lila's humming grew into soft songs, wordless but clear, and Jacob joined her once, his voice rough but brave. The ranch was no paradise. Water was scarce, the roof leaked in one corner, but it was a place where broken things could rest. Elias stood on the porch one night, watching the stars when Clara joined him. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Live without looking over my shoulder." Elias took a slow breath. "You don't have to know yet, just keep walking." She nodded, her hands unclenched, and for the first time she sat beside him, the space between them small but safe. The ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, its people learning each other's silences, their scars knitting together like roots in good soil. The sun hung low over Willow Creek Ranch, painting the fields in hues of amber and shadow, when a sharp dust cloud rose on the horizon, stirred by hooves and ill intent. The air, heavy with the scent of dry grass and distant rain, grew tense as Jasper Vance rode up, flanked by two rough men, their faces scarred and eyes cold. His horse snorted, kicking up dirt at the fence line, and Jasper's gaze swept the ranch like a vulture circling carrion. Elias Hawthorne stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his sons, Samuel, Nathan, and Jacob, forming a quiet line behind him, their postures rigid but steady. Clara emerged from the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour, her eyes narrowing at the sight of her father. Rose followed, her braids swinging, fists clenched as if ready to strike, while Lila lingered in the doorway, her humming silenced, her fingers gripping the frame. Jasper dismounted with a sneer, his coat dirtier than before, his revolver gleaming at his hip. "Thought you could steal what's mine," he called, voice loud enough to carry across the yard. Elias stood firm, his grey eyes unyielding. "They ain't yours. They walked away. This is their home now." Jasper laughed, bitter and sharp, gesturing to his men. "Law says they're mine to claim, and I've got debts to settle." Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We're not your property. You sold us once, and we're done with you." Rose's lip curled, her words venomous. "You come to drag us back? Try it." Lila pressed closer to her sisters, her eyes wide but her stance resolute. The hired men shifted, hands hovering near their belts, their silence heavy with threat. Samuel moved closer, to Clara, his broad frame a quiet shield, while Nathan's eyes locked on Rose, ready to act. Jacob stood in front of Lila, his young face hard, his hands steady despite the tremor in his breath. Jasper's smirk widened, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think this ranch makes you free? You're nothing but strays living off a fool's charity." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low, deliberate. "This is a home, not a cage. You're not welcome here. Leave." Jasper's hand twitched toward his revolver, and the air grew thick. The moment stretched, taut like a bowstring. From the ridge, hooves thundered, and a lone rider appeared, dust trailing behind him. It was Preacher Amos, his coat flapping, his face weathered by years of mediating Ashwick's troubles. He pulled up sharp, his horse snorting, and surveyed the scene with tired eyes. "Trouble here, Elias?" he asked, glancing from Jasper to the sisters. Jasper spat into the dirt. "This man stole my daughters, took 'em like they were his to keep." Clara's voice rang out, clear and fierce. "He didn't steal us. You put us on a crate to sell like livestock. Elias gave us a choice." Rose stepped beside her, her anger raw. "I've got scars from you. Want to count them?" Lila's voice, soft but steady, added, "We chose to stay." The preacher dismounted, his boots heavy on the ground, and looked to Elias. "You holding them against their will?" Elias shook his head. "I opened my door. They walked through it. That's all." Amos turned to the sisters, his gaze gentle but searching. "You want to be here?" Clara nodded, her eyes never leaving Jasper's. "Yes." Rose and Lila echoed her, their voices a chorus of defiance. Jasper's face twisted, his voice rising. "I've got witnesses who saw the auction. They're mine by right." Amos raised a hand, his tone firm. "Law don't let you sell your kin to pay your sins, Vance. These women chose their path. You've no claim here." Jasper's men shifted, but Amos's stare pinned them. "You want trouble, you'll find it in a cell. I don't care how many guns you carry." The standoff held, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Jasper's sneer faltered, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the sisters' resolve, and Elias's unyielding calm. He spat again, his voice low and venomous. "This ain't over." Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "It is here." Jasper mounted his horse, jerking the reins, and his men followed, their retreat a grudging surrender. The dust settled, and Amos lingered, his eyes on Elias. "You've taken on a hard road, Hawthorne. Keep it steady." Elias nodded. "Always do." The preacher rode off, leaving the ranch in a silence that shivered with relief. Clara exhaled, her hands unclenching, and looked at Elias. "You didn't have to face him for us." Elias's voice was quiet, certain. "Yes, I did." Rose's eyes flicked to Nathan, a flicker of gratitude she didn't voice. Lila stepped forward, her fingers brushing Jacob's sleeve, a silent thank you. The brothers stood closer now, their presence a wall of quiet strength. As the sun sank, the family returned to the house, the weight of the confrontation lingering, but not breaking them. Clara resumed her work in the kitchen, her movements slower, more thoughtful. Rose sat on the porch, sharpening a stick with her knife, her anger cooling into something fiercer. Resolve. Lila knelt in the garden, her hands in the soil, whispering to her plants as if to reassure them. Elias stood by the fence, his pipe unlit, watching the horizon where Jasper had vanished. Samuel joined him, his voice low. "Will he come back?" Elias shrugged. "Maybe, but we'll be here." The ranch settled into dusk, the stars emerging like promises kept. Inside, the sisters sat together, not speaking, just being, their shoulders touching in the lamplight. The house felt stronger, its walls holding not just wood, but trust, forged in the fire of that moment. Elias stepped inside, his boots soft, on the floor, and nodded at Clara. She returned the gesture, a small acknowledgement of a bond not yet named. The night closed around them, gentle and warm, the ranch a beacon in a world that had tried to break them, but failed. With Jasper Vance's shadow-gone Willow Creek Ranch exhaled, its fields bathed in the gentle light of a spring that finally felt real. The air carried the scent of new grass and damp earth, a quiet promise of growth that mirrored the slow blooming within the house. Clara, Rose, and Lila had settled into the rhythm of the ranch, their movements less guarded, their silences softer. Clara's mornings now began in the garden, her hands coaxing life from the soil, planting rows of beans and carrots with a care that felt like defiance. Her laughter, once rare, spilled out one day when a rabbit stole a lettuce leaf, a sound that startled Samuel, who was mending a gate nearby. He grinned, his broad hands pausing, and offered her a handful of seeds wrapped in linen, his voice low. "Found these in the barn, thought you'd make better use of them." Clara took them, her fingers brushing his, and nodded, her eyes holding his a moment longer than before. Rose, meanwhile, had taken to the horses with a passion, her fierce energy finding a match in their restless spirits. Nathan taught her to saddle them properly, his hands steady as he showed her how to tighten the cinch, his jokes lighter now, less forced. One afternoon, as they brushed a mare in the corral, Rose admitted, "I used to think trust was a trap." Nathan looked at her, his usual grin absent. "It's not, it's just hard won." She nodded, her braids swinging, and handed him the brush, a gesture small but heavy with meaning. Lila's world was the garden, where green shoots now stood, proud, tended by her gentle hands. She spent hours there, her humming now woven with words, old songs she half remembered. Jacob joined her often, his shy presence a comfort as he built trellises for her climbing vines. One day, he gave her a woven bracelet he'd made from twine, his face pink as he mumbled, "Thought it'd suit you." Lila tied it on, her smile, bright and unguarded, and handed him a sprig of mint from her garden. "For you," she said, and he tucked it into his pocket like a treasure. Elias watched these moments from the porch, his pipe in hand, carving wooden figures, a hawk for Clara, a fox for Rose, a sparrow for Lila, each one left where they'd find it. Clara kept hers on her windowsill, Rose tucked hers in her pocket, and Lila wove hers into a nest of twigs. The brothers, too, were changing. Samuel opened up to Clara one evening, his voice rough as he spoke of his mother's death, how the ranch had felt hollow without her. Clara listened, her hands still on a potato she was peeling, and said, "I don't remember my mother's face anymore, just her hands." Samuel nodded, their shared grief a bridge. Nathan's restlessness eased, his stories now about the future, not just the past. And Rose listened, her arms uncrossed, her eyes soft when he spoke of wanting to see the ocean someday. Jacob, usually quiet, began sharing his dreams with Lila, confessing he'd thought of leaving the ranch but now wasn't sure. "You don't have to decide yet," Lila said, her voice gentle, and he smiled, his shoulders lighter. The house hummed with new life, its rooms filled with small acts of care. Clara baked pies now, their crusts golden, their scent drawing everyone to the table. Rose joined Nathan in the barn, their laughter echoing when a horse nudged her into a hay bale. Lila's songs grew louder, and she taught Jacob a melody, their voices blending one evening as they sat by the garden. Elias remained a steady anchor, his presence a quiet assurance. One night Clara joined him on the porch, her hawk figure in hand. "I've been waiting for the catch," she said, her voice low, "for you to ask something of us." Elias shook his head, his eyes on the stars. "Trust ain't about asking, it's about giving without expecting back." Clara looked at him, her guard not gone but thinner, like ice melting in spring. Rose, too, found herself softening, her sharp edges dulled by Nathan's patience. She caught him watching her one evening as she braided Lila's hair, her fingers gentle despite her usual fire. "You stare like I'm something fragile," she said, half teasing. Nathan's voice was earnest. "Not fragile, just worth seeing." She didn't snap back, just nodded, her smile faint but real. Lila's joy was quieter, her songs now a gift she shared freely. She baked bread one morning, its crust imperfect but warm, and set a slice by Jacob's plate. He ate it slowly, his eyes bright, and later showed her how to twist rope into a swing for the oak tree. The ranch itself seemed to respond, its fields greener, its air lighter. Meals were no longer silent, the table a place of shared stories and soft laughter. Clara told of a river she'd seen as a child, its water so clear it held the sky. Samuel promised to take her to one nearby someday. Rose challenged Nathan to a race across the field, her boots pounding the earth, her grin wide when he let her win. Lila sang for the group one night, her voice high and clear, and Jacob joined in. His harmony clumsy but heartfelt. Elias carved more figures, leaving them like silent blessings. One evening Clara sat with him, her voice steady. "I thought trust was something you earn through pain, but you've never asked us to hurt." Elias looked at her, his hands still, on a half-carved sparrow. "You've hurt enough. This is about living." She nodded, her fingers tracing the hawk's wings, and stayed beside him, the night wrapping them in quiet understanding. The brothers and sisters moved together now, not as strangers but as pieces of a whole, their bonds unspoken but strong. The ranch was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where roots were taking hold, deep and stubborn, in soil once thought too hard to yield. The stars above burned brighter, witnesses to a family being built, not by force, but by choice. Spring had fully claimed Willow Creek Ranch, its fields now lush with green, the air sweet with wildflowers and the hum of bees. The house stood prouder, its porch no longer sagging but bolstered by new beams, a testament to the hands that had found purpose in its care. Clara, Rose, and Lila had woven themselves into the ranch's heartbeat, their presence as vital as the creek that sang again after years of silence. One evening, as the sky burned lavender and gold, Clara stepped onto the porch, her arms uncrossed, her eyes steady. Elias Hawthorne sat carving a new figure, a dove this time, his knife moving with quiet precision. Rose and Lila were inside, their laughter mingling with the clatter of dishes, a sound that warmed the house like a fire. Clara cleared her throat, her voice firm but soft. "We've been here months. We're not guests anymore. We want to stay, not because we have to, but because this is ours too." Elias looked up, his grey eyes warm, and nodded. "Then it's yours." She took a breath, glancing at the house. "We'd like to talk to you all, together." Elias set his knife down, called his sons, Samuel, Nathan, and Jacob, and the six gathered at the kitchen table, the lamplight casting soft shadows. Rose spoke first, her chin high, her voice clear. "I want to marry Nathan, not because he saved me, but because he sees me as I am and stays anyway." Nathan's grin was soft, his hand reaching for hers under the table, his usual chatter replaced by a nod. Lila, her bracelet woven with mint leaves, looked at Jacob. "I'm young, but I know I want Jacob to wait for me. He makes the world feel safe." Jacob blushed, his shy smile bright, and whispered, "I'll wait as long as you need." Clara turned to Samuel, her hand finding his, her voice steady. "I thought love was a debt I'd have to pay with pain." Samuel never asked. For that, he just let me be enough. Samuel's eyes shone, his voice low. "You've always been enough." Elias leaned back, his hands folded, his heart full as he looked at his sons and the women who'd become daughters. "You don't need my blessing, but you have it. Always will." The decision sparked a quiet joy, and plans for a wedding under the ranch's cottonwoods took root. The town of Ashwick, once a stage for cruelty, arrived with curiosity and pies, their clean shirts a stark contrast to the auction's grim memory. The ceremony was simple, held in the shade of trees whispering with new leaves. Clara and Mabel stitched dresses from soft cotton, their seams careful, their colors muted but warm. Rose wore her boots, unapologetic, a wildflower tucked into her braid. Lila wove flowers into her hair, her smile bright as she stood beside Jacob. The brothers wore their best coats brushed clean, their faces proud but nervous. Elias stood before them, not as a preacher but as a witness, his voice rough with feeling. "You've seen each other's scars. That's worth more than any vow made in haste. Love that holds after the storm is love that lasts." The vows were plain, spoken from hearts that knew the weight of promises. Rose pledged to Nathan to never hide her fire, and he vowed to stand beside it, not tame it. Lila promised Jacob laughter, even when shadows fell, and he swore to be her anchor, steady and true. Clara spoke to Samuel of truth, raw and unadorned, and he promised to meet it with his own, no matter the cost. The kisses were gentle, not a claim but a confirmation of lives already entwined. That night, the ranch glowed with lanterns hung from branches, their light dancing like fireflies. Nathan played a fiddle, his notes lively, while Rose challenged him to a dance, her boots stomping the earth, her laughter free. Lila swayed with Jacob, her bare feet light on the grass, her woven bracelet brushing his wrist. Clara stood with Samuel under the stars, his hand resting lightly on her back, a touch that said, "I'm here," without needing words. The townsfolk ate and talked, their earlier judgment softened by the sight of joy so hard-earned. Elias sat on the porch, his pipe unlit, watching the scene unfold. Samuel joined him, his voice quiet. "You made this possible?" Elias shook his head. "I just held the door open." They walked through. Clara approached later, alone, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle. She placed it in Elias's lap, her eyes steady. He unwrapped it to find the wooden hawk he'd carved, now painted with delicate vines curling around its wings. "For you," she said. "You didn't just give us a place. You gave us a life." Elias ran his thumb over the vines, his throat tight. "You gave me something too, a reason to keep going." She sat beside him, the porch creaking as Rose and Nathan joined, their laughter spilling over. Lila and Jacob followed, her hand in his, her song soft in the air. The brothers and sisters sat together, no longer strangers but a family forged by choice, their bonds stronger than any blood. The night stretched on, the air thick with the scent of bread and wildflowers, the stars above bearing witness to a love that had grown in defiance of pain. The ranch, once a refuge, was now a home, its walls holding not just wood but stories, laughter, and the quiet strength of those who'd chosen to stay. Elias looked at the faces around him, their scars softened by the glow of lanterns, and felt the weight of his own grief lift, just enough to breathe. The wind stirred, gentle now, carrying the promise of a new season, one where the past was not forgotten, but outshone by the present. The porch held them all, a stage for a life rebuilt, its creaks a song of resilience and hope. Years later, Willow Creek Ranch thrived, its fields green, its laughter loud. Clara, Rose and Lila, now truly hawthorns, tended the land with their husbands. Elias, grey but content, carved doves for grandchildren. Under starlit skies the family flourished, their scars mere whispers in a home built on love.